Welcome back, everyone, to Part 8 of our Masterclass Explainer series on sepsis, clinical documentation, and coding. I am seriously thrilled to guide you through today's session, mostly because we're getting into the absolute core of objective chart auditing. Today, we're zeroing in on the SOFA score, breaking down the 6 organ systems, and mastering the baseline adjustment rules. If you're a clinical documentation integrity specialist, a medical coder, or an auditor, well, this is the exact framework you need to objectively evaluate the Sepsis 3 criteria in the medical record. So let's just dive right in.
Here is a quick look at our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The Sepsis 3 and SOFA framework. 2. The 2-point rule. 3. The 6 organ systems. 4. The baseline adjustment rule. And 5. Audit defense and CDI.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Sepsis 3 and the SOFA framework.
You know, when we review complex patient charts, we really can't just rely on vague clinical impressions. So what actually links Sepsis 3 clinical criteria directly to coding integrity? How do we bridge that gap between a physician's working diagnosis and bulletproof compliance? Well, the answer lies in a universally recognized scoring system.
And that system is the SOFA scale, the Sequential Organ Failure Assessment. This is literally the objective measurement backbone used to evaluate and diagnose sepsis 3 based on an acute increase of greater than 2 points from the patient's baseline. Remember, back in 2016, the Surviving Sepsis Campaign and the Third International Consensus totally shifted the landscape. They officially defined sepsis as life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by a dysregulated host response to infection, and they threw out the old SIRS concept entirely. So to definitively prove that life-threatening organ dysfunction actually exists in the chart, we have to use the SOFA scale. It's the definitive standard now.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 2-point rule, which is the core requirement here.
This single, powerful number is exactly what every CDI specialist and coder must be hunting for, greater than 2. For a sepsis diagnosis to be clinically valid under Sepsis 3, the medical record absolutely must show an acute increase of 2 or more points on the SOFA scale. Honestly, if you don't have that shift, you don't have Sepsis 3. It is incredibly black and white when it comes to this objective data.
Let's break down the complete formula. To secure this diagnosis, a physician's documentation has to clearly demonstrate 3 things. Step 1, a documented or suspected source of infection. Step 2, that acute increase of 2 or more points on the SOFA scale. And Step 3, which is absolutely vital, that change has to be measured against the patient's baseline score. We are looking for an acute shift that is actively caused by the infection, not just the background noise of chronic illness.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 6 organ systems. Let's deconstruct this.
So where exactly are these points coming from? Think of this as your hunting ground as an auditor or a CDI specialist. You have to know exactly which labs and vitals correlate to which specific organ system. Starting with the respiratory system, we measure the PaO2 over FiO2 ratio. For coagulation, you're checking the lab reports for a drop in the platelet count. For the hepatic or hepatobiliary system, you are looking at bilirubin levels in milligrams per deciliter. Over to the cardiovascular system, you're scanning the vitals for the mean arterial pressure, the MAP. Or you're checking the MAR to see if vasopressors are being administered just to maintain blood pressure. For neurologic function, it's all about the Glasgow Coma Scale or GCS score. And finally, for the renal system, you are monitoring creatinine levels or a significant drop in urine output. Whenever you review a chart, you are constantly cross-referencing the physician's documentation of infection against acute, measurable declines in these 6 specific areas.
Now for Section 4, the baseline adjustment rule. This is a critical application concept.
I literally cannot overstate this point. This is arguably the most critical concept for real-world chart auditing. The SOFA score must be confirmed using the patient's baseline clinical information. Why does this matter so much? Well, because you simply cannot accurately measure an acute decline if you don't know where the patient's organ function started in the first place. A patient with chronic health issues might walk through the hospital doors already scoring points on a standard SOFA scale. We aren't measuring their chronic state, right? We are strictly measuring the acute organ dysfunction triggered by the new infection.
Let's bring this rule to life with a really common scenario. Imagine a patient with pre-existing chronic kidney disease, or CKD. We check their historical labs, and their baseline creatinine is sitting at 1.5. Now, in a totally healthy patient, a 1.5 might trigger an alarm, but for this specific patient, that is just their normal baseline. Therefore, to actually award a renal SOFA point, their creatinine must acutely spike to 2.0 or higher. That acute shift of greater than 2 points on the overall SOFA scale relies entirely on establishing these baseline adjustments, system by system.
Finally, Section 5,
Audit, defense, and CDI. Let's talk actionable strategies. Knowing all this clinical theory is great, but applying this knowledge to actually protect facility revenue, that is where you truly bring value. So here is your actionable chart review process. Step 1. Validate the clinical indicators in the record yourself. Don't just take the word sepsis at face value. Actually do the math. Find that greater than 2-point SOFA shift based on the patient's unique baseline. Step 2. Ensure the provider explicitly links that organ dysfunction to the sepsis in their diagnostic statement. And step 3. If that shift is missing, or if the linkage is even slightly vague, query the provider immediately. Do not wait for an auditor to catch it. You must establish this clinical validity well before the final code assignment.
And trust me, payer auditors are actively looking for reasons to deny these complex sepsis claims. As our guidelines clearly tell us, code assignment requires validating clinical conditions prior to coding. One of the most common denial tactics we see is when payer auditors argue that the organ dysfunction is caused solely by a localized infection, like a simple UTI or pneumonia, and not a systemic dysregulated host response. If the provider doesn't directly and explicitly associate the organ dysfunction with sepsis, the auditor will strike it down in a heartbeat. The provider's diagnostic statement is king, but as CMS clearly states, the clinical evidence, like our adjusted SOFA score, must be present in the medical record to actually support that assignment.
By mastering the SOFA scale, understanding those 6 vital organ systems, and strictly applying the baseline adjustment rules, you completely transform a vulnerable medical record into an airtight, compliant claim. But what happens when a facility relies on a fast, bedside screening tool instead of this rigorous diagnostic scale? How much revenue is bleeding out because of that confusion? Stay tuned for Part 9, where we decode the QSOFA tool, its clinical utility versus its diagnostic limitations. Until then, keep learning and keep leveling up. This is Decode Healthcare with Harshal.